The courtroom buzzed with tension as former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi stepped confidently toward the plaintiff's table. Dressed in a sleek navy blue suit, her golden hair neatly tied back, she exuded the same air of authority that had once made her a formidable force in legal and political circles. Her opponent today was Judge Raymond Hollister, a man known for his sharp tongue, questionable ethics, and open disdain for conservative figures like Bondi. He had a history of ruling with bias, twisting legal interpretations to suit his personal vendettas. Today, he had been assigned, rather controversially, to preside over a high-profile defamation case in which Bondi was representing a client against a powerful media conglomerate. As the session commenced, Judge Hollister leaned back in his chair, eyeing Bondi with a smirk. His salt and pepper beard twitched as he prepared to unleash his usual mix of sarcasm and disdain. Well, he drawled, flipping through the case file. Ms. Bondi back in court. How predictable. Bondi remained unfazed. She had encountered his type before, men who mistook condescension for intellect. She simply adjusted her notes and looked up. With all due respect, Your Honor, I assume we're here to discuss the case, not personal opinions, she said, her tone calm but firm. Hollister let out a chuckle. Of course. But let's be honest, Ms. Bondi, what is this really about? A political stunt? A desperate grasp for relevance? Because let's face it, you're not exactly newsworthy anymore. A few gasps rippled through the courtroom. The opposing attorneys smirked, clearly enjoying the show. Bondi's jaw tightened, but she didn't take the bait. Instead, she turned to the real issue at hand. My client, a private citizen, was maliciously defamed by the media. We have evidence proving that false statements were knowingly aired to damage her reputation, Bondi said, sliding a thick folder across the table toward the judge. Hollister lazily picked it up, flipped through a few pages, and tossed it aside like it was yesterday's newspaper. Ms. Bondi, let's cut the nonsense. You and I both know that the media has the right to free speech. Just because you don't like what they say doesn't mean you get to silence them. Or is that your latest agenda? Bondi's fists clenched under the table, but she kept her face unreadable. Free speech does not extend to knowingly publishing false information that destroys someone's livelihood. Hollister sneered. Spare me the lectures. We all know how the game works. You attack the press, you sue them, and you hope to make a political comeback on the headlines. Bondi exhaled sharply. Your Honor, if you've already made up your mind before the trial even begins, perhaps you should recuse yourself. Hollister's eyes flashed with irritation. Excuse me? Bondi's gaze was unwavering. You just openly ridiculed me before the court, dismissed critical evidence without reviewing it, and insulted the very premise of this case. That is clear bias. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Hollister's face turned red. He wasn't used to being called out like this. Watch your tone, Ms. Bondi, he snapped, slamming his gavel. You're already treading very dangerous territory. Bondi, however, refused to back down. She knew she was onto something bigger than a courtroom spat. There was a pattern to Hollister's behavior, an agenda that went beyond just this case, and she was about to prove it. The tension in the courtroom thickened like an approaching storm. Judge Hollister, visibly irked by Pam Bondi's unwavering defiance, glared down at her from his elevated seat. His fingers drummed irritably on the bench as murmurs rippled through the audience. You've got a lot of nerve, Ms. Bondi, he growled, his voice dripping with hostility. Perhaps you've forgotten how this works. I am the judge. You are merely a lawyer. You don't get to dictate how I run my courtroom. Bondi, cool and composed, leaned slightly forward. And perhaps you've forgotten, Your Honor, that a judge's role is to ensure a fair trial, not to belittle attorneys and dismiss evidence before a case even begins. Hollister's face darkened. His authority had been challenged publicly. He had always enjoyed lording over his courtroom, intimidating those who dared to question him. But Bondi wasn't intimidated. If anything, she looked annoyed. You're out of line, Hollister barked, pointing a finger at her. I could hold you in contempt right now. Bondi met his gaze, unfazed. For what? asserting my client's right to a fair hearing. Hollister slammed his gavel again. I don't have time for this nonsense. The media has every right to report what they see fit. Case dismissed. Collective gasp filled the courtroom. The opposing attorneys exchanged victorious smirks, while Bondi's client, an elderly woman who had been slandered on national television, let out a small cry of disbelief. Bondi, however, didn't flinch. She had anticipated this move. With all due respect, Your Honor, you don't have the authority to dismiss this case before hearing the arguments, she said, her voice sharp. That's a direct violation of judicial conduct. Hollister's smirk faltered for a moment. He hadn't expected her to push back this hard. This is my courtroom, he snapped. I decide what happens here. Bondi nodded. Yes, and your behavior today proves that you are unfit to preside over this case. That's why I've already filed a formal judicial misconduct complaint against you. A stunned silence filled the room. Hollister stiffened, his hands gripping the bench. What? He hissed. Bondi reached into her briefcase and pulled out a neatly printed document. She held it up for all to see. This is an official complaint to the Judicial Conduct Board outlining your repeated violations of impartiality, she declared. Your history of bias and intimidation tactics is well documented. You have violated Canon 2A of the Judicial Code, which requires judges to uphold the integrity and impartiality of the court. The courtroom erupted. Some gasped, others whispered frantically. The opposing attorneys no longer looked smug, they looked worried. Hollister's face was now a deep shade of crimson. You think you can get away with this? He sputtered. I am a sitting judge. Bondi gave a measured nod. And judges are not above the law. Before Hollister could respond, the back doors of the courtroom swung open. A team of federal agents in dark suits stepped inside. The lead agent, a tall woman with sharp features, held up a badge. Judge Hollister, she said, her voice commanding. You are under investigation for judicial corruption and abuse of power. You are hereby relieved of duty pending further inquiry. Hollister's face contorted in rage. You can't do this. But before he could finish, two agents stepped forward, placing firm hands on his arms. The judge jerked back violently, his robe billowing. This is outrageous, he bellowed. I'll have all of you disbarred for this. Bondi simply watched, arms crossed, as the once mighty judge was escorted from his own courtroom. Looks like justice still has a place in this country after all, she murmured. As Hollister was dragged away, Bondi turned to her stunned client and gave her a reassuring nod. Your case will be heard fairly now, she promised. The battle wasn't over yet, but Pam Bondi had just won the first and most important round. The moment Judge Hollister was escorted out of the courtroom, chaos erupted. Reporters who had been seated in the gallery scrambled for their phones, firing off frantic texts and emails. The news of a sitting judge being removed mid-trial was unprecedented, and the fact that Pam Bondi had orchestrated it made it even more explosive. Bondi remained calm, collecting her case files as the court officers worked to restore order. The courtroom bailiff, looking unsure of what to do next, approached her. Ms. Bondi, he said hesitantly. What happens now? Do we get another judge? Bondi nodded. Yes, a new judge will be assigned. And this time, it'll be someone who actually follows the law. Across the room, the lead attorney for the media conglomerate, the one who had been smirking just minutes earlier, now looked pale. He knew what this meant. Without Hollister's interference, the case would proceed fairly, and that was a disaster for his side. He stormed up to Bondi, his voice low and harsh. Do you have any idea what you've just done? Bondi calmly turned to face him. Yes, she said. I just made sure justice isn't for sale. He scoffed. Oh, please. You think this changes anything? You think your little stunt is going to stop the media from winning? Bondi smiled, the kind of smile that signaled she wasn't done yet. You don't seem to understand what just happened, she said. Judge Hollister wasn't just biased, he was compromised. And if you were relying on him to hand you an easy win, then maybe you should start preparing for an actual trial. The attorney clenched his jaw but said nothing. He knew she was right. Without Hollister, their entire strategy had crumbled. At that moment, Bondi's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a message from a federal investigator, one of the agents who had taken Hollister away. "We need to talk. Immediately." Bondi's heart quickened slightly. She knew the judge was corrupt, but if federal agents were reaching out this fast, it meant this went deeper than anyone realized. She turned to her client. "I need to step out for a moment. Stay with my assistant. I'll be right back." With that, she strode purposefully out of the courtroom, past the swarm of reporters gathering in the halls, and into a secluded side corridor where a man in a dark suit waited for her. "Pam Bondi?" he asked, extending a hand. She shook it firmly. "That's me. What's going on?" The agent glanced around, ensuring they were alone, before lowering his voice. "You were right about Hollister," he said. "But you don't know how right." Bondi frowned. "Meaning?" The agent took a deep breath. "This isn't just about judicial misconduct. Hollister has been under federal investigation for months. We've been tracking a network of judges and officials taking bribes to manipulate high-profile cases." Bondi's eyes narrowed. "Are you telling me Hollister was bought off?" The agent nodded grimly. "Yes, and we have reason to believe that the media conglomerate you're up against was involved." Bondi exhaled sharply. She had suspected foul play, but this was bigger than she imagined. "You have proof?" she asked. The agent handed her a file. "We were planning to move on this in a few weeks, but your confrontation in court forced our hand. Hollister was arrogant. He thought he was untouchable. But when you called him out, we had no choice but to pull the trigger." Bondi flipped through the file, scanning the evidence, bank transfers, secret meetings, damning emails. "This?" she murmured. "This could blow the whole thing wide open." The agent nodded. "Exactly. But now that Hollister is in custody, his associates are going to panic. And that means you're in danger." Bondi looked up. "I can handle myself." The agent gave her a knowing look. "Pam, you just humiliated a corrupt judge on national television. You exposed a rigged system. People like that don't go down quietly." Bondi straightened, determination flashing in her eyes. "Then let them come," she said. "Because I'm not backing down." The agent nodded. "Good. Because we're going to need you to help us bring them all down." Bondi stared at the file in her hands. The courtroom battle was over, but the real war was just beginning. Pam Bondi's mind raced as she walked back into the courtroom. The weight of the file in her hands felt heavier now, not just because of the evidence, but because of what it meant. This case was no longer just about a defamation lawsuit. It was about a network of corruption that stretched far beyond one crooked judge. As she approached her table, her assistant, Lisa Carter, leaned in, her expression tense. "What happened?" Lisa whispered. Bondi didn't answer right away. She glanced at the opposing legal team. They were nervous. They knew the game had changed. Finally, she murmured, "Hollister wasn't working alone." Lisa's eyes widened. "You mean?" "Yes," Bondi cut in. "And we have proof." Before Lisa could respond, a court officer stepped forward and cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, a new judge has been assigned. Court will reconvene in 30 minutes. Bondi nodded. That was good news. A fresh judge meant a fresh start. But she had bigger problems now. She took out her phone and dialed a number. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Pam, what the hell happened in that courtroom?" Bondi smirked. "Senator Mark Reynolds. A longtime ally and someone she trusted when it came to fighting corruption. I just got a sitting judge removed for misconduct," she said casually. A low whistle came from the other end. "And I assume that's just the tip of the iceberg?" Bondi glanced at the file in her hands. "Way bigger than I expected," she admitted. "There's a whole network of compromised officials, judges, attorneys, even media executives. And I just blew a hole through their defenses." There was a pause. Then Reynolds said, "Meet me at my office. Now." Bondi sighed. "I have a case to win first." Reynolds chuckled. "I doubt they'll be stupid enough to continue fighting you in court now. But be careful. You just kicked the hornet's nest." "I'm counting on it," Bondi replied before hanging up. Pam Bondi wasn't easily intimidated. But as she stepped outside the courthouse for a moment of fresh air, she noticed something that put her on edge. A black SUV, idling across the street. Dark-tinted windows. No license plate visible. She recognized the look, private security. The kind hired by people who didn't want their business traced. Her gut told her she was being watched. Lisa stepped beside her. You see it too? Bondi nodded. Yeah, we're officially in their crosshairs. Lisa hesitated. Should we call the feds? Bondi exhaled. Not yet. Let's see if they make a move. They didn't have to wait long. As Bondi and Lisa walked back toward the courthouse doors, a man in a gray suit stepped out of the SUV and casually approached them. Ms. Bondi, he greeted, his tone polite but cold. I represent certain interests who are concerned about the direction this case is taking. Bondi folded her arms. Let me guess. You're here to offer me a deal. The man smiled thinly. More like a warning. You've made some powerful enemies today. Bondi smirked. Good. That means I'm doing something right. His smile didn't waver, but his voice dropped lower. You don't understand what you're up against. You could make this all go away. Walk away now, and no one has to get hurt. Lisa tensed beside her, but Bondi didn't blink. You think you can intimidate me? She asked. I've taken on drug lords, mob bosses, and corrupt politicians. And you think a guy in a cheap suit is going to scare me off? The man's expression hardened. This isn't a game, Ms. Bondi. Drop the case. Stop digging. Or next time, we won't be having a conversation. Bondi took a step closer, eyes locked onto his. You tell your bosses that I'm just getting started. She turned and walked away, leaving the man standing there. Lisa swallowed hard. Pam, that guy wasn't bluffing. I know, Bondi said, which means we need to move fast. The battle in court was one thing, but now it was war. Pam Bondi walked back into the courthouse with a new sense of urgency. The case itself was still important, but now she knew it was just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. A network of corruption was operating behind the scenes, and she had just become their biggest threat. She had two choices, back down or push forward. And Bondi had never been one to back down. Lisa caught up with her as they entered the courtroom. Pam, what's the plan? She asked in a hushed voice. Bondi handed Lisa the federal investigation file she had received earlier. I need you to get this to Senator Reynolds now. Lisa's eyes widened. What about the trial? I can handle that, Bondi assured her. But Reynolds has connections at the DOJ. If we get this into the right hands, we can take down the whole operation. Lisa nodded, gripping the file tightly before slipping out a side door. Now it was just Bondi and her opponents. A trial they didn't expect. Bondi sat at the plaintiff's table, waiting as the new judge entered the courtroom. Judge Franklin Harper presiding, the bailiff announced. Bondi immediately recognized the name. Harper was known for his no-nonsense approach. Fair. Unbiased. The exact opposite of Hollister. As soon as everyone was seated, Harper adjusted his glasses and scanned the room. Well, he said, it seems there's been quite a bit of excitement in my courtroom today. Ms. Bondi, are you prepared to proceed? Bondi stood. Yes, Your Honor. The opposing attorney, still rattled from everything that had happened, also rose. Your Honor, in light of recent events, we'd like to request a continuance. Harper raised a hand. Denied. The attorney blinked. But you had an entire trial under Judge Hollister. I have reviewed the records, and I see no reason why this can't be settled today. Bondi smirked. Finally, fair playing field. As the trial continued, Bondi picked apart every lie, every weak argument, every false claim made by the defense. Without Hollister protecting them, the media conglomerate's case fell apart. By the time closing arguments arrived, it was clear who was winning. Bondi stepped forward. Your Honor, this case has always been about one thing, truth. The media has a responsibility to report facts, not smear campaigns. My client's reputation was destroyed by malicious lies, and now, the very people responsible are scrambling because they've lost their protection. She let that sit in the air for a moment before finishing. Justice isn't for sale. And today, I ask this court to set the record straight. The opposing attorney gave a weak rebuttal, but it was clear the damage was done. Judge Harper sighed. I'll need a short recess to make my ruling. Court is adjourned for 30 minutes. Bondi sat down, finally allowing herself a deep breath. The case was as good as won. But then, her phone buzzed. A text from Lisa. We've got a problem. Bondi immediately stepped out into the hallway and called Lisa. Talk to me. Lisa's voice was tense. I gave the file to Reynolds. He went straight to the DOJ. But someone inside the system must have tipped off the people we're after, because they're trying to make this disappear. Bondi clenched her jaw. How bad is it? They're shutting down the investigation, trying to bury it before it reaches the public. Bondi exhaled sharply. They were still trying to cover their tracks. She knew what had to be done. Lisa, get Reynolds to call a press conference, she said. We're going public. Now. Lisa hesitated. Are you sure? This is dangerous. Bondi's eyes hardened. We don't have a choice. If they're trying this hard to keep it quiet, then we need to make sure it's too big to ignore. Lisa exhaled. I'll take care of it. Bondi hung up and marched back into the courtroom. A few minutes later, Judge Harper returned to his bench. He cleared his throat. After reviewing the evidence and testimony, the court finds in favor of the plaintiff. Bondi's client gasped. The courtroom erupted. Bondi simply smiled. The media conglomerate had lost. And now their corrupt backers were about to be exposed to the world. Within hours, the story broke. Senator Reynolds held a live press conference revealing everything. Hollister's corruption, the bribery network, and the attempts to silence the case. The Department of Justice was forced to reopen the investigation. More names came out. Judges, lawyers, media executives. Arrests were made. And the black SUV that had been watching Bondi? Gone. The message was clear. She had won. Lisa grinned as they watched the news unfold. You actually did it, she said. Bondi smirked. I told them they picked the wrong fight. As the sun set over the city, Pam Bondi knew this battle was over. But the war for justice, that fight never ended.